Hey everyone. Great to see the people trickling in. We're going to give it a minute or two for the room to get filled up. We're really excited to have everybody here today for this session. Hey everyone, really excited to be joined here today by Sean, Anna, and Jack. I'll introduce them a little bit more in a bit. Um, some people still trickling in, but we figured it's probably best to get started. Today's session really is I think a temperature check on where EPDs are today and how we think about the connections between supply chains, manufacturing, and procurement and design in the built environment. Uh, Trying to turn this data landscape that's evolved and shifted and continues to evolve today into real decisions that people make to transform projects. Um, there's a lot said these days, one direction or another, about the role that AI will have in our future and in the future of the built environment and manufacturing. And I think that's just as relevant here as it is other places. We've all heard the cautionary tale from the sort of like world of professional, life, where, well, where are we left if it's the AI that writes the email and another AI that answers it, right? And an AI that performs the task. And obviously, in a sense, this can have sort of dystopian undertones. But as a sort of thought experiment, I think in this conversation, as we think about the data layer connecting sustainable manufacturing to sustainable construction, let's think about the future where systems of EPD generation, right, use AI to streamline data collection from manufacturers' supply chains, and that moves into workflow tools that procurement professionals or designers use to make better material selections based on those EPDs matching their criteria. And if all of these processes, right, are informed by AI, in some sense, my supposition is that it's actually like a much less dystopian future, and actually a way that we can reduce the amount of manual work that it takes to make these connections between supply chains and buildings. Um, and I think too, like there's risks in this process around third-party verification, validity, verifiability, and really crucially, the way we turn data and data pipelines into real decisions that change the way we build buildings and cities. We see that EPDs, right, on their own, are less and less of a differentiator as they become more common, and that we also need so many more EPDs to exist. This, crucially as well, is a data problem that systems like AI or LLMs, right, are well equipped to help with. So today's conversation brings together four people who sit at different points in this system: a program operator, an AI-enabled EPD generation platform, a manufacturer who's seen how LCA helps them redesign their products, and C.Scale is really happy to be the convener here as a whole life carbon building platform that helps turn all this data into decisions made by specifiers each day. So I'll give some introductions in turn, and then as we move into questions, the speakers can speak more about themselves as part of their responses. First, I want to introduce Anna Lasso. Anna, we're so excited for you to be here. Anna runs Smart EPD, a fully digital EPD program operator working to make verified, machine-readable product data accessible and verified at scale. She spent close to a decade leading North America's largest EPD program before Smart EPD. Anna, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jack.
Next on my screen is Jack Cove, who leads go-to-market at Pathways. Jack was part of the founding team at Pathways, and Pathways is an AI-enabled platform that automates LCA and EPD production for material manufacturers, really focused today on the heavy building material space. Really looking to you, Jack, through this session to think about questions about how you keep data credible when AI is doing more of the work.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Finally, Sean, really excited to have you here today. Sean leads Lightly, one of the first luminaire companies in North America to publish an EPD, and he's been using LCA as design school since his first EPD revealed where the carbon actually lives in his luminaire products. And his second generation EPD shows us how LCA can be a decision-making tool to reduce the environmental impacts of those things. So with that, that's the people you see in front of you. We have a poll to figure out who's in the audience. Can we bring up that poll to figure out who's out there? All these people saying other. I am really curious to hear how you describe what it is that you do to your children, please, because I want to understand in simple terms. But no, this is a really great mix of manufacturers, EPD professionals, and people using EPDs to specify or procure materials. I see, Julia. Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. All right, well, maybe we close the poll there. I think this is probably interesting to everybody on the panel to understand how to sort of orient questions. And I really want to ask the first question to you as we dig into the EPD ecosystem. You've been on multiple sides of this ecosystem: LCA consultant, program manager, built digital infrastructure as a program operator. In terms that even I could understand, how would you describe where the lines are between who creates, verifies, and uses EPD data, and how are those lines sort of shifting or blurring today?
Okay. So I think the system was originally designed with very clear roles where consultants or practitioners would generate the lifecycle assessment, and independent verifiers and program operators would safeguard the integrity of that declaration by going through the verification process, and then the market would use the data. So very clear buckets. What's changing is that digital tools and AI are collapsing part of that chain and sometimes allowing the same entities to generate, manage, and publish declaration data. So in a world of automated EPDs, this independence becomes really the backbone of credibility. And that's why the role of a truly independent verification process and program oversight matters now more than ever.
Let's maybe move that.
Short answer. So that was
no, that's amazing. I think it sort of makes clear the stakes, like the way the stakes are changing today, and maybe that also sort of sets up, a layer down in that process. Jack, you sit in the production layer. You're ingesting messy, I would have to assume, manufactured data and using that to generate LCAs. How do you relate, sort of, to program operators and the verification layer on one side, and make sense and draw insights from the data on the other end?
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate the kind of simplicity with which you shared that perspective, and I'm sure the people in this room could talk about that for 3 hours and generally land on the same conclusion. I completely agree with what Anna just said, and as a provider and facilitator of EPD generation, we work in partnership with program operators and verifiers like Anna's team, but it is critical that those two parties are separate. And we care deeply about the value of EPDs and the quality of EPDs, But as an industry, as a market, as a community, the moment that EPDs become less reliable, then the whole industry will crumble. So we are using AI, we are embedding technology in a lot of workflows that address mass data ingestion and data processing, and reducing the amount of time that a lot of people who already have very difficult jobs have spent cleaning and copying and pasting and trying to understand the complexity of EPDs. And we also want to make it as easy as possible for someone like Smart EPD to verify EPDs in a way that is efficient without compromising quality in any capacity. So I think our incentives are very aligned, and we have to hold each other accountable. And there's not a world that we see at Pathways where one entity is doing everything, because that independent kind of audit, that independent verification is crucial to upholding the value of EPDs for the long term.
And I think with this, right, there's I won't, maybe I'll like be dramatic and call it a risk that this whole conversation spends its time in this middle layer of like how the sausage gets made, how EPDs come together and verified. But really at the end of the day, the goal of the EPD exists on sort of the two opposite sides of that. The manufacturer on one side trying to do better with their products, and the procurement professionals and designers on the other trying to make better decisions. Sean, EPDs are wonky, right? And you sort of helped bring EPDs and this kind of life cycle thinking into the lighting space. What was it like to get started? What were common misconceptions that you had? What were some gotchas? And how have EPDs and your sort of the way you've folded into this ecosystem helped change your approach to manufacturing?
Sure. Yeah. So initially, as you can imagine, and for the other manufacturers out there, if you haven't gone through it, it's the fear of the unknown, and it can be scary, because if you sit and read through an EPD, it can be 50 pages. It's got a lot of technical terms, a lot of tables. Then you sign up your LCA consultant who can help you through that, or a program that can help you gain the EPD and look through the life cycle analysis of all your components. And there's a lot of questions about what's going on with how you make your products, what the energy uses are, where they're coming from. And again, when you get started, it can look really complex. But after we did our first EPD, and as we were kind of reaching the end of that process, we realized it's not a lot different than what we do in other areas. So we're generally creating bills of materials for our products, and we're outlining, we already know what components go into our products, what the ingredients are. For UL listings, we define sometimes what the mass of each unit is. For procurement, we define a lot of these metrics as well. We know where things are coming from. And so it's really just another column in your bill of materials, is one way to think about it, where we're now trying to analyze what the embodied carbon is in that, for that part of the EPD. And so as we go through that, you can find as much data as you need, as you're able to. And that's kind of the rule of EPDs is, if the data doesn't exist, there's other ways to estimate embodied carbon intensity. And so that's okay. Ideally we want it as clean as possible, but the second one went a lot easier and a lot more quickly. And now it's just part of how we design products.
I think I had the chance, John, this obviously, to visit your factory. Maybe that was 6 months ago at this point. And it really felt like just being in Lightly's factory. I was in a wood shop, not in a luminaire manufacturer. And it shows I don't know exactly, like these EPDs sort of, will ensconce certain sorts of data with certain sorts of metrics, but there's all these intangibles that they don't capture. Like the quality of life of the people working in the factory, the production process, the other sort of you do a lot of wood sourcing, focus on sustainable and regional sourcing in the Northeast. I think all that stuff is really not an EPD, but it shows the commitment at Lightly to life cycle thinking. So absolutely. Product manufacturing is super complex, but it turns out so are buildings on the other end. And I think one thing that we hope at C.Scale, right, gives structure to the EPD market, is that it unifies a demand signal and gives market access to better products. This is, in a sense, to me, where we sit in the whole building LCA space, absolutely essential that better products with better EPDs have a competitive advantage against, people who are, we'll say like, further just with less well-designed manufacturing processes. I don't know quite how to say that politely, but there's a lot of work to be done, and we want to give cleaner products a winning advantage. But there's all sorts of other ideas where somebody might get an EPD, and I want to open up a poll with maybe our assumptions about why should a manufacturer get an EPD. And if you have a contrary opinion, we're really open to hearing it if you want to share it in the chat.
Less others this time around.
Looks like this is settling out. I want to, maybe we can close the poll. And Jack, Cove, if I can sort of pick on you for a minute, in like conversations we've been having over the past while, I was really interested to see that access to bids actually was not at the top of the list, but something you guys see in the EPD generation space is that it's often that a lot of the deal flow that comes to you comes from lost bids because people didn't have an EPD. Yeah. Maybe there's like insights you have about how this might vary by product category, like why maybe that doesn't show up exactly the same way here. But how do you see access to bids in your work kind of informing the generation, or like we'll say the generation of EPDs by manufacturers?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we all know EPD adoption and how different parties think about EPDs is such a broad spectrum across geographies, across different product verticals or product groups. But something that we found by talking to hundreds of manufacturers who are evaluating EPDs as a business decision or investment is that people often do have some uncertainty about what the ROI on that investment is. It's not always explicitly clear that if we do this, then we will get this in return. And I'm really curious to get Sean's perspective on this, but what we often find is people are quite hesitant to make that investment proactively, and kind of the kick in the butt that they often need is seeing a job come up or a spec coming up in their market that is requiring EPDs and being a little bit behind the ball and not prepared to put their best foot forward to win that project specifically. It's particularly interesting around now in how, historically federal and state and local policy is what drove EPD development and adoption in the US, but we're now seeing big ticket commercial projects like data centers and banks and education and healthcare infrastructure more frequently require EPDs, and people are associating EPDs as one of the requirements that are needed to actually take part in those bids. So I was not surprised to see that as kind of like the leading reason. And, it's obviously not mutually exclusive from product differentiation or trying to increase or improve engagement with specific parts of the procurement process. I think most manufacturers, regardless of geography or vertical, are expecting an EPD to give them access to more parts of the market. And I think that's only going to happen more and more.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jack. And to touch on, why should we even do this? And is it because people are making us doing it? And regulations are causing it, or bidding is requiring it? I think if that's your mindset, you're going to be too late to the table. And there's many competitors out there that are getting ahead of it. And the reason that we justify it internally, first of all, it is part of our mission, and so it's who we are. We built this company as a low carbon company, and are very passionate about that. But we found all these other benefits. Yes, you can get on the job if it's a qualifier. Yes, you can get in the door if it's a qualifier. But we see today, and certainly in the future, building low carbon products is just better business. We've been in an environment for the last 100 years of declining energy costs, and that has caused this trend of globalization and cheap materials that, even though they take a lot of energy to create, they can still be inexpensive. As energy costs start to rise, you're going to see a very strong correlation between energy input to your product and cost. Take a ceiling tile, for example, that has to use natural gas to dry it out. Do you know how much money Armstrong spends on drying out those ceiling tiles every year in natural gas? That's a heavy cost. And so the more we can take the energy out, the lower the cost becomes. And as Jack Rusk mentioned, when you come to our factory and you see the culture and the quality of life and the healthiness of the facility, it makes a difference in hiring and turnover and a lot of these other factors, not to mention the fact that a lot of our materials are now local, because they're lower carbon and they can be locally sourced, we can now deliver more quickly to our customers. And so there's this whole suite of, ancillary benefits beyond just the government's making me do this or the GC's making me do this that we need to, focus on as well.
Yeah, that's super interesting and is very in line with what we see with most people who we do see move proactively on this. It is a strategic decision that is embedded in their long-term strategy. It's not related to a specific project or one piece of feedback that they got. And it's not just because they want to be a good person or because they want to feel good about having a lower carbon or just because they want to win one project. When people are doing it proactively, it is more so the way I think of it is it's coming up in the kind of leadership discussions and they are saying, we want to move forward with this because we believe it will help us on these 3 or 4 different axes.
Absolutely.
In the poll, there's this other thing that came up that I think is an interesting kind of thread to pull on here. 44% of respondents talked about EPDs being a differentiator against other products. And I think this is sort of like for the specifiers in the room, when you think about EPDs, they're really tuned towards a certain kind of comparison, maybe within a product category or governed by the same product category rule. And you'll see these asterisks somewhere about comparability where it is and isn't appropriate. But at the end of the day, like people are using EPDs to make comparative, to make decisions and compare. From your perspective as a program operator, Anna, how do you see like guardrails on this sort of comparability? Or how would you sort of comment on the simultaneous need to make good comparisons and the messiness of comparisons in like as procurement and buildings come together?
Yeah, that's quite a loaded question, but definitely one that needs to be discussed. I think, product category rules are intended to be able to compare products within a like category. So it's when we're trying to compare across different material classes, it becomes an issue. For example, if you're not really making sure you're looking at the functional differences between those products, because so many of the PCRs we have right now are just focused on not looking at the equivalence, right, further downstream in terms of the building performance. So I think there's a real risk there when you're at the design level making comparisons. But I think once you are locked into some of those decisions and you are in a position to be comparing between products within a like category, that's where the PCR is really positioned to help those products shine. That said, there's still a lot of assumptions that are not clarified in product category rules. We've seen a unique evolution of PCRs. Some are in their 3rd or 4th iteration, some are just getting started. And we're seeing how the artificial noise that's introduced from one LCA practitioner to another, one tool to another, background data sets and allocation decisions and a lot of things that, folks that are using EPD information don't really appreciate, and I don't think they really should have to appreciate. So we're trying to get much more prescriptive on these next generation of PCRs. There's a lot of different issues which kind of prevent us from saying thou shalt absolutely do this when it comes to licensing and tool availability and things like that. But we're trying to sharpen our pencils and get much more prescriptive and generate a next PCRs that are digitized in and of themselves, so there's no ambiguity in terms of how to interpret that verification layer. I'm kind of going off the rails here, but we recognize that directionally you can compare products within one category. I wouldn't say, you know, there's a margin of error, and there have been procurement tools which have tried to capture that margin of error, but it needs to be done in a directional sense at this point, unless something is generated from the same tool with the same background assumptions and whatnot. So we're getting there, but it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Well, and it's with that, like EPDs really, you know, connect the messiness of supply chains with the messiness of building design and procurement. And I think I'm really thankful for people like everybody on this call for wrangling that ecosystem, like working in collaboration across it to make people's lives on both sides a little bit easier and those connections a little richer. From our perspective, really sort of on the other end, sort of from Sean, and interacting with specifiers, you know, here it's like there's such a need to use EPDs to amplify demand signals for better materials, use that to shift supply chains, translating carbon targets back to the material spec and vice versa, and ensuring that in that nothing gets lost in translation, right? Now, with this sort of translation of data through an EPD for use in making decisions, questions of trust arise. And I think these questions of trust are sharpened in the sort of when we start talking about the way that AI-assisted processes might help with specification, might help with manufacturer data management, might be involved in EP generation or verification layer. And I want to sort of ask maybe the audience explicitly, what do you look for in EPDs to make them trustworthy? What are sort of things you'll look at? And if it's present, you feel good. And if it's absent, you might raise an eyebrow or ask more questions. Signal's pretty clear so far, but you know, we love dissenting opinions. If anybody has a other they want to share in the chat. All right, well, this is great, and I think gives us sort of enough to go on for the next bit of this. And I think this very much is in your court. Standard EPD verification processes were maybe designed for a different world, right? LCA data was gathered manually. EPDs took, there's data collection requirements that mean EPDs take time, but the LCA itself behind the EPD took a lot more time to produce. As the way data is being collected by manufacturers changes, as the way the LCA behind EPDs is, generated changes, how is verification changing in time to ensure that 80% of respondents-ish who really rely on third-party verification as a crucial step? How is verification adapting to this changing landscape?
Sure. Well, I think it's a huge risk that if verification does not adapt, because the risk is that speed really starts to outrun scrutiny. And so if AI is being used to not only aggregate data, create the data lake, map the data, generate the LCA models, produce the EPD outputs, and we're asking it to do that instantly, we can't rely on verification processes that were designed for static reports produced over the many months that you just indicated. And we can't rely on that, resource-wise, that's just not feasible. I think a lot of consultants have enjoyed that, patting their pockets over the years, but that's not, we need other solutions at scale. So verification has to shift upstream and thinking towards how do we validate those models? How do we validate the approach to data set mapping, the templates, and the rules that are embedded in the system, while still maintaining independent oversight of the final declarations? So it's not just looking at deliverables, it's looking at workflows and making sure that there's good oversight of those workflows from a process standpoint, and that things are locked in and immutable, and we have confidence that things can't change unless they are subject to additional verification. So, and that's something we're exploring too at Smart EPD, is how do we combine the best of human intelligence with artificial intelligence? Because we need to be, as verifiers, reverse engineering everything that's going on from the AI generation side. And I don't think there are enough people looking at it through that lens of, standing at the end and looking back on the whole process.
Jack Cove, from your perspective, these like the pre-verification that Anna referred to as part of that, how does that sit with you as a EPG generator? Is there, we'll say, like, how do you build as a tool provider for EPDs and LCA strong relationships with the verification step?
Yeah, it's interesting because EPDs are obviously all about transparency, and this is almost a natural evolution of we need to continue transparency throughout the ecosystem. And what has always been a issue for any EPD verification or LCA modeling, dating back to when things were very manual. If things are a black box and one person is verifying something that they can't explain and they don't understand, that's obviously a problem. And I think that is still true today. So as we're building technologies that really try to alleviate a lot of the challenges that have plagued efficient and affordable and scalable EPD management, we simultaneously need to be building systems that provide transparency to verifiers and to program operators and to our customers, so they actually know how we're getting to the answer and what we're doing. We don't want to be a black box that keeps all the science behind closed doors and says you have to trust us. Like we talked about at the top of the webinar, I think EPDs are valuable because they are independently verified. And if that independent verification is no longer considered valuable or reliable, then EPDs won't. So we have a responsibility to build tooling that maintains kind of that quality of verification and empowers verifiers and program operators to still have that same confidence and ability to really trust everything that we're sharing and understand how we're getting to that answer. The reverse engineering that Anna mentioned, that resonates and is something that we're always considering.
Well, and I really want to sort of tee you back up here. Some platforms publish EPDs under a claim of pre-verification, not always with independent review of the data going into it. What's the risk that do you see risk in this? And if so, what is that risk? Like, how would you, like, there's other dimensions to pre-verification worth maybe illustrating.
Yeah, I think that's a really important follow-up question, Jack. I think there's a huge risk to the market in that they start to confuse this system validation or verification with the actual verification of the declaration itself. We all know that garbage in equals garbage out. And you can have a beautiful model and you're plugging it with garbage data, you're going to get an incorrect EPD. So even though a tool can be reviewed to conform with a methodology and a workflow, if that data going into the EPD is not assessed in some way, or there's not guardrails set up around it, and again, what's the role of the tool? What's the role of the verifier or the program operator in trying to address that data, that layer? What is the appropriate assurance for that? So I think there's a lot of confusion, and rightly so, around saying when an EPD tool is pre-verified, and that is applied very loosely and means many different things. But the risk is manufacturers are taking on reputational risk in using such tools. We're seeing litigation in Nordic countries around tools being used in that way. Designers may be taking on inaccurate data. And overall, I think it just really serves to undermine the overall credibility of EPDs to be used as an effective decision-making tool.
This conversation will continue to unfold for the next 5 years, I think, in this space. And I appreciate laying the,
you can have a zero to that.
We'll have another webinar just on that. And I think there's a lot more to be said.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm going to take two of the sort of questions on our list and put them together for you, Sean. On one hand, Lightly's done amazing work using LCA and EPDs as part of your design process. to identify the hot spots in aluminum, replace it with hardwood, thinking about the way that as you make better design decisions, hot spots move, right? Like, I want to hear about that process for you. And I also want to understand from your perspective some of the the way you balance this thinking that's very metrics driven with all the other intangibles of bringing a product to market. What people want, how you think about supply chains, how you think about the people putting it together. What sort of role do you see, like the design work that you've done using LCA? How do you think about that alongside all of the other factors you balance as somebody running a manufacturing company?
Sure. Again, this is who we are, and our mission is to be a low carbon company. And so that is our North Star that, we're always shooting for. But initially we went out to the market and, positioned ourselves as the most sustainable luminaire on the planet. And we quickly surfaced that is important to a lot of folks, but there's things that are game state level stakes to just get to the table, up to the table out of the gate. And, as soon as you say you're sustainable, it does raise a lot of questions around reliability and cost as the number one focus and overall risk. And so we've had to change our messaging a little bit. Again, our North Star is still low carbon design, but we do lead today with reliability and performance. And, we are the same cost as the traditional systems. And so for the manufacturers out there that are going down this path, recognize that those things are still, the most important, I will say, and are the table stakes. But you got to focus on the carbon. And today we look at our design decisions through a carbon lens. It's almost like we have night vision goggles on, but it's identifying carbon instead of things at night. And we look at materials now with that carbon density in mind. And so my engineers, coming from a mechanical design background where they could design anything out of metal, always want to be putting metal into the product. And they've learned now that the first try is to not use metal, because we know that the carbon density is off the charts. And so that doesn't mean that we have to eliminate all metal from our product. You can still have hard point mounting and metal suspension, these critical items. You don't have to go all the way, but that's how we look at it today. And those are some of the tensions that we have to balance.
I think that's just like an essential perspective. And there's this, it almost feels like a Zen koan or something, Sean, where like you make the comment again and again that EPDs are both table stakes and the long game, like it's, and I think there's really something in like a process of continuous improvement that many manufacturers engage in. That's exactly these things. Like, it's always what we need today, and it's what we need to set the path for the next 10 years. There's a couple of questions in the chat, and I want to make sure we get to those. And if there's anything else people want to put in, get it in there. And we'll sort of, as those questions percolate in for the last few minutes, really kind of lightning round. Many agents, contractors, architecture firms, large owners are setting internal product standards, right? Whether it's by clean at a policy level or just organizational standards. What would it take from your perspective in the ecosystem? Like, what problem do you need to solve? I don't know if that's the right way to say it, to make this common practice throughout the whole industry. Like, if you could wave your magic wand, deploy, your version of the IRA to solve this bottleneck, what's it going to take for these standards to become commonplace across the industry? No pressure.
This is for all of us.
Yeah, I can comment quickly on how I see this unfolding over the next kind of 20 years. As the initial demand is starting in some materials, and there's some public legislation that's leaning in this direction. There's some private companies that are starting to get down to the level of their buildings and their carbon action plans. And so I see that continuing to happen, and those forces continuing to scale. It's really only just a small form of where it's going to be in 5 to 10 years, especially on the private side. Who knows what's going to really happen on the public side. But as that starts to happen, again, manufacturers, these big guys, they're already starting to realize that this isn't just something that they have to do for compliance, but this is good business. to design low carbon products. Again, the materials are more local oftentimes. They are often less expensive because there's less energy input into them. They look more natural. They feel more natural. They bring all these benefits to the people that work around them. There's all these health, things that are right in line with carbon. And so I see that starting to pick up here already and really accelerate the adoption. And then you layer in the AI component of really accelerating the information shortage that we have right now and the analysis shortage that we have right now. Again, the future that we all want is we build this building, we design this building, and it's immediately telling us what the carbon impact of our design decisions are, and immediately showing us all the different options of products that we have and all the different trade-offs, and analyzing that in a much more efficient way than the current contractor industry works today.
That's awesome. Jack or Anna, you want to opine?
Yeah.
Oh.
Go ahead, Anna.
Thanks, Jack. I mean, I see it as pivotal success that so many of the things that we need to have in place are shared infrastructure, particularly around the product category rules, because everybody really benefits from them, but funding them is quite a challenge. And getting the right stakeholders to the table for PCR creation, especially the like procurement and policy folks, as well as the designers and engineers. We want to know how they're using EPDs, but I think really good EPDs start with really good standards, and folks don't know what goes into that process. So I really want to see stronger alignment there across all stakeholders and figuring out what does cost sharing look like for everyone is depending on that data ultimately. So until we have really, really good standards that are digitized and kind of serve as the lingua franca for all tool implementers, this is going to be really, really fragmented. And then investment in public data sets too. That's a whole other conversation. But there's so many different pieces in this ecosystem that need to work well to create really good EPDs. Mm-hmm. And it takes the whole ecosystem being aware of what those issues are.
I love sessions like this, honestly, because it brings together some of that ecosystem. Jack, would you like to jump in here? And then I want to get to at least one of these questions. And if people want to vote on the questions, it'll help us figure out where to start.
Yeah. I think I'll add a slightly different perspective. I agree with both of those, and unsurprisingly, there's a lot of different things that I think we all expect are crucial in order to get into a point where EPD adoption is truly normalized across the industry. One of the things that Sean mentioned that we have heard time and time again from manufacturers is there's not really in the short term a promise of a green premium, that just if you have a slightly lower carbon product that you're going to charge 50% more than the competition. And similarly, there's a lot of uncertainty, like I mentioned earlier, on the ROI that comes with EPDs. I think as we continue to see manufacturers like Lightly and companies that have invested in EPDs be rewarded and be demonstrated differentiation by having EPDs, there will be a flywheel of companies with EPDs being rewarded and seeing that return on investment, similar to any other investment in performance or in brand. And I think as owners and architects and engineers not only ask for this information, but actually use it as a decision criteria more and more often, that's really going to be necessary and is going to create that higher velocity of EPD generation and adoption.
Thank you for sharing those perspectives. There's a number of questions coming through in the chat. The one that I'll share here from Brad talks about the way LCA and EPD data quality is already fraught. Hey, are we just introducing this new error band? What's the standard for veracity? And with this question, right? I think this isn't something that we'll get to an answer to today, but it's really going to be a lens that we're all going to move in the next few years with, to understand how to build a stronger data ecosystem between verifiers, generators, procurement and specification tools like C.Scale, and the manufacturers building and bringing these products to market. There's other questions in the chat. Speakers, if you want to sort of share your contact in the chat. People can reach out directly there. But I just want to say we're really excited to be at C.Scale supporting the EPD ecosystem more and more, giving people the ability within their LCA models and carbon assessment models they build in C.Scale to explore EPDs. We're doing this in collaboration with Building Transparency. I see Allison and I think Aziza on this call. Like, great to have you guys here, and really excited about what's ahead between C.Scale and Building Transparency. And really, I think to the questions of data openness, so enthusiastic about the idea of having a mission-aligned nonprofit at the center of the data ecosystem here. From our perspective, as a private enterprise trying to get more carbon assessments into more buildings, having trusted nonprofit governance for core data infrastructure is absolutely essential. So really enthusiastic about the work that Building Transparency has been doing, building and defending that infrastructure for the entire industry. We're going to be respectful of the schedule we set and close it out here. Everybody is available to follow-ups, and I really appreciate both presenters' insights and the insights in the chat. And looking through the attendees here, there's a lot of people who are very involved in this ecosystem. So I really appreciate everybody coming to the table to share thoughts today. Thank you, everybody, and happy Friday.